Hey everyone, this is Mike, and today we're going to be talking about our new Savage raid here. It's been out for about 3 weeks at this point. Me and my group have been playing through it for those 3 weeks as well, and I thought I'd give it a little bit more time before I made this video, so that we could actually get a couple of re-clears done as well, and also figure out some different ways of handling certain mechanics, because especially in E9 Savage, we really brute forced our way through that fight. And thus I wanted to actually get to finesse that fight a little bit more, rather than just take our sledgehammer and try to brute force it, as it were, because that's what we did week 1, meaning that our second clear of that in week 2 was incredibly bad, but then we optimized it a little bit more, which you can see in the background as well. And now I actually quite enjoy the fight, because it allows me to appreciate the mechanics that are in there a little bit more. And that is what I wanted to talk about in today's video. Talk about some of the mechanics of this new raid tier, because there are a couple of really cool mechanics in there, here or there, mixed throughout the fight, and just kind of give my thoughts on this final raid tier that we have gotten in Shadowbringers. So let's start off with E9 Savage. When we first went through this, as I mentioned before, we really brute forced our way through the mechanic. We did certain things completely wrong because we just didn't have certain information, especially the brambles we handled really badly. And then the tile phase in space, or in the void, whatever you want to call that tile set, we didn't really handle that all that well either. We did some extra time like last week, where we optimized the fight a little bit more to make the brambles better with our positioning, as well as breaking the tethers and all of that stuff, because that was really an issue for us. And then we also optimized the void tiles a lot more as well, which I do think that the void tile set is probably the best part of this whole fight. As a fight in general, I think it is pretty cool. There are multiple ways on how you can handle the tank busters, with using invulns, tank swaps. Me and my paladin even started using cover on certain tank busters to make it so that he gets the vuln up from using cover on me. I use cooldowns to actually take the tank buster, and then he runs back in to mitigate auto attack, so that our healers don't necessarily need to heal me up immediately. So there's a lot of cool stuff that you can do there. When it comes down to the flow of the fight itself, you are switching through these 3 different tile sets. You have the castle, where she basically shows you a couple of things with the Art of Darkness mechanic, then of course the second time around you see it. You also have this clone mechanic attached to it. Then you go into the bramble phase, or the forest phase, where you're playing around with the brambles, the flower placement, and then of course the 2 big mechanics as well, the anti-air phaser or something, and then the wide angled one. It was pretty cool to figure those out as well. And then you move over to the void tile set, which, as I mentioned before, it's my favorite phase into the fight, because it is very different from what you are used to. Usually you can just run all over the place and it'll be fine, but here you really need to make sure that you give everyone their space. You need to social distance to make sure that people don't run into the same tile, because then the tile will drop, of course, and probably result in some deaths. And then of course you get to do it a second time around, where you get a second run through these 3 phases with different mechanics layered on top of it, which I did think is a pretty cool mechanical flow throughout the fight. I do quite enjoy it. Now, what I was really surprised by, I guess you could say, is the fact that this fight is incredibly punishing. If you miss, for example, a cloud that goes into the boss during the void tile phase, she gets a permanent damage up buff that she takes throughout the rest of the fight. And then of course tank busters are gonna hit harder, raid wides are gonna hit harder as well, and it just makes the fight a whole lot more difficult in general. Not only that, but every time somebody dies and there is an Art of Darkness mechanic where you have to either spread around the boss or stack together, there is a high chance people are gonna be dying again as well, because she will always do all of her attacks, meaning that all 4 of the stack markers will go out and all 8 of the laser beams will go out as well. And if you only have like 7 or 6 players to share those things with, then you don't have enough and more people are going to be dying. So for a first fight, mechanically, I do think that the fight is quite nice, but I was very surprised with how unforgiving it is towards people dying or fucking up a mechanic here or there, like for example with the clouds going into the boss. Overall though, really enjoyable fight, I must say, but I'm a little bit surprised by how unforgiving it is for it being the first fight in the raid tier. Definitely was not expecting that. Then moving over to E10 Savage. I'm a really big fan of this fight. My static maybe not so much, but I do think that the shadow mechanic is really interesting. It's something that goes throughout the whole fight again as well. Sometimes it's your shadow, sometimes it's the boss's shadow, sometimes it's a mix of the 2, where you have to be placing the boss's shadow in certain positions to resolve certain mechanics. Overall, I do think that even though this same mechanic of the shadow comes back relatively often in this fight, it is always paired up with new mechanics or introduced in a different way, that I do think that it keeps the fight relatively fresh. Outside of just the shadow mechanics, we of course have the umbral orbs as well, which is a very different way of looking at a tank buster and a stack marker. Usually the boss will just be like, okay, I am casting a tank buster and it is going on the main tank, or it is going on both of the tanks, or a tank swap needs to happen or something like that. Or there will be another mechanic where someone will be targeted with a stack marker and then players just group up on that player to share the stack damage. Now this time around it is very different. The tank buster itself can be either a tank buster or a stack marker, depending if it's edge or unleashed. And then we also have these two umbral orbs, the purple one being the tank buster, the orange one being a stack marker, but they don't function in the same way as, okay, the purple orbs are just gonna go on the tanks, the orange ones are going to go on the healers, for example, but they just go on the nearest person to them, so you have to actively walk towards where your tank buster is going to be or where your stack marker is going to be, which is something that I don't think we've ever really had. Maybe sometimes there would be something on the arena that needs to be soaked with a specific amount of players, but definitely not in the way that it was done in this fight, and I do quite enjoy the way that they did it. There is one part in the fight where there's like a bunch of hounds jumping around and then you have to go to the edge to soak your orb, so to speak, and that was a mechanic that sometimes orbs would go into the wrong players even though everybody was kind of in the correct position, so I'm not quite sure if that is just us kind of screwing up the positioning over there or if there is some spaghetti code going on over there, but overall I do have to say it was quite cool. The best mechanic in this fight in my opinion is definitely Void Gate Amplifier, because there are just so many different things coming together, and it was also really cool to see that you actually had to use your shadow that you spawn to soak the towers as well, which I thought was really cool. Unfortunately enough, how cool the mechanic might be, my group personally is not going to be seeing it anymore. First week we saw it, of course, because we were minimum item level. Second week we barely saw half of it, and then the third week, which we cleared this week, we didn't even see the mechanic begin either. We technically saw the cast bar, but we didn't actually have to do any of the mechanics because the boss died at that point, and now we have even more weapons, even more gear. So I'm pretty sure that we're not really going to be seeing that mechanic anymore, which I do think is a little bit of a pity because it is a really cool mechanic to execute, and how the way the mechanic works as well with the shadows, where you have to place them to soak the towers and all of that cool stuff. Moving over to E11 Savage now. For a couple of people that I know, this is their favorite fight of this raid tier, and I can totally see why. For me, I'm not quite sure which one is my favorite just yet, but this is definitely a really cool fight. You're fighting a combination of Tancred as well as Ranjit, which Ranjit is a pretty important character in the main story, where Tancred is the Gunbreaker and then Ranjit has that dragon around him and such, and they combine them for a fight now in this Savage raid tier as well. Really cool to see, because I'm pretty sure this is just an original boss, which is something that we didn't really see all that much of yet, so it's really nice to have that. And the mechanics really work together with that as well, with all of the whole Gunbreaker toolkit, so to speak. When it comes down to the mechanics of this fight, I can see why some people might call it repetitive, because there are essentially three main mechanics that go on, which is either you're gonna spread across to do the Protean waves, then you have the slice through the arena, and then you also have that prey marker that goes on someone. And those mechanics come back a lot in this fight. Of course, they're always going to be paired up with an element, which is what makes this mechanic fun, or these different mechanics fun, because you'll have to not only identify the mechanic that he's doing, you'll also have to identify what element is being imbued on that mechanic, so to speak. And then you'll have to act accordingly, because depending on what element is happening, the second part of the mechanic is going to look very different as to what you want to be doing with these different things. Like, for example, you want to spread into spread again, or you need to spread into stacks, or you have to move away from the boss a little bit more when he cleaves the arena, or you need to make sure you go to the middle of the arena so that you don't get knocked off or something like that. I do think that was quite cool overall. Even though the mechanics repeat quite a bit, there are a lot of different things thrown in together with that as well. There are kind of like trio-like mechanics, so to speak, where the boss goes away and you have to execute some kind of a mechanic whilst the boss isn't there. The boss usually also surrounds the arena, where they will be doing their burst strikes through the arena. I think it's called Burn Strike in this fight, but basically it's the burst strike from Gunbreaker really. Which is really fun, because it kind of makes you feel like a little bit of an ultimate fight as well, because you're doing those trios where the boss is at the edge of the arena. Kind of gives me that feeling as well. And overall the flow of the fight is actually very fast paced, which makes for a pretty fun encounter design. Again, the three main mechanics do come back quite a lot, which might be a little bit of a downside for some players, but I do think that the different mechanics that are always paired up with it do keep it fresh enough for me personally. And then of course at the end you get the cycle of fates where all of the mechanics come back to back in like a rapid fire mode, which is a really fun phase of the fight as well. So overall I do quite enjoy it. And then last but not least we have E12 Savage. This is of course a two-part fight where we first have our door boss Eden's Promise, and then we have Oracle of Darkness as our second fight. I already talked about these fights a little bit more in depth in a previous video that I made last week where I talked about a door boss done right. You can go check that out if you want to. But basically these two fights were really well designed because they both feel as their own fight and they also don't feel like they were elongated for the sake of just having a full-length fight, which is one of the things that I disliked about the Stormblood door bosses, was that usually the second phase at least, first phase maybe not so much, but especially the second phase usually was just made longer for the sake of being longer and not for the sake of showing extra mechanics, which this time around they didn't do. When we look at Eden's Promise itself, they show you the primal mechanics, what all of the different primals can do, then they start throwing in the normal mechanical rotation that the fight still has, but there is still a lot of RNG involved with this fight as well because of the different primals that are always going to be summoned by Eden's Promise. It was a really cool way of doing it, especially also lore-wise, because we have constantly been summoning primals ourselves throughout our whole expansion of raiding in Shadowbringers, basically, where we've always been calling up on these imaginations of the primals to fight them to basically restore the empty, I believe it is called, or something like that. And now Eden's Promise is basically using that against us, where Eden's Promise is going to be summoning those primals to fight us now. So that was pretty cool to see as well. It adds a little bit of RNG into the fight as well, where you always have to be thinking about what primal did they imbue themselves with or something like that, because in the beginning it's just gonna be costs where, okay, I'm drawing power from these two primals, that is gonna be it, but then later down the fight it's gonna be about stocking those primals, releasing them later into the fight, and also mixing in together other mechanics with that. That was my discourse, not yours. So I do think that overall this was a really cool fight. And then we have our final phase, our Oracle of Darkness, Gaia. I thought this fight was also really well done, also thematically wise, because technically Voidwalker E2 Savage, Gaia was inside of that armor over there. And you can see a little bit of that here as well, because some of the mechanics come back. First thing that she does is a time-like mechanic that you saw in E2 Savage, where she's gonna be casting these two abilities, but there is a delayed activation effect attached to them, kind of like you did in E2 Savage. And these mechanics will also come back later during the relativity mechanics, where again you are going to be playing with time. The order of all of the mechanics was relatively simple. It was just in the beginning she does something random, so to speak, then you have a relativity mechanic, an apocalypse, and then that is going to repeat 2 more times with different relativity mechanics and a different apocalypse mechanic as well, first, second and third. And every time they build upon what was already there. In the very first relativity mechanic they show that, okay, you're gonna have to think in advance, so to speak, where you want to position yourself somewhere, drop your rewind button over there and then execute something else, so that by the end of the mechanic you just get rewound back to that certain position, and then that resolves the mechanic for you. For the apocalypse, it's first going to be with one AoE going through the arena and then her mechanics going on, and then later on again that will be built upon by more explosions going off at the same time. When it came down to executing this fight, we first were thinking that the relativity mechanics was going to be the most difficult of this fight, because there is just so much going on in them, but once you figure everything out, it was definitely the easier part of the fight compared to the apocalypse mechanic, which at first we thought apocalypse was going to be easier. This is of course purely talking about execution, because when it comes down to relativity, when you know what needs to happen, it is just a factor of I stand in this position when I have this debuff, and that is pretty much it. When it comes down to figuring everything out, I must imagine it was a whole lot harder, because of course you need to figure out what do all of these debuffs do, where can we position ourselves exactly because of how big these explosions are going to be or something like that. On 2 of the relativity mechanics, the arena itself is going to be doing a bunch of stuff as well, so you need to figure all that stuff out as well. But because we were late to the party, so to speak, we cleared over the week and we could just look at the World First group or some other people that had cleared and could just very quickly go like, okay, they had these debuffs, they positioned themselves in these positions, okay, that will resolve the mechanics. So execution wise it definitely wasn't too hard when it comes down to the relativity mechanics, but figuring it out must have definitely been a whole lot harder than I can probably give it credit for, because of course I was not around there to figure them out myself. When it comes down to the apocalypse mechanics, that's usually where I see a lot of execution errors for not only myself but the rest of my group as well, and when I watched streams and such during Prague. that was probably where the most mistakes happened with damage down markers and that kind of stuff, because it is a lot tighter to do all of the dodges than it is during the relativity mechanics. However, I do still think that both the relativity mechanics as well as the apocalypse mechanics were a lot of fun, because they're basically the reverse of each other, right? During relativity, you are going to be placing down rewind buttons throughout the fight to get rewound back to a specific place where your mechanics will resolve, whereas in the apocalypse mechanics is the other way around, because she is going to show you where all of these different explosions are going to go off, and then once she's shown you where they're all going to go off, they also actually go off, and then you need to dodge around seeing where everything happened and that kind of stuff. Definitely thought that was pretty cool to do as well. So overall, this raid tier I've enjoyed quite a bit for these first 3 weeks already. First impressions of the raid tier are very positive so far. I'm definitely looking forward to doing them a lot more as well in the future as we go and work towards our best in slot. And I wouldn't be surprised if we keep doing the fights a little bit more past the point of everyone in our group being best in slot to also gear some alts here or there. But that's pretty much going to do it for me. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of these fights. Which fights have you done so far? Which one is your favorite? Was it a specific mechanic that you thought was really clever? Like, for example, for me personally, the shadow mechanic of E10 Savage I thought was just really brilliant. And that is probably one of my favorite things about that fight as well. But yeah, anyways, let me know in the comments down below what you thought of it. I'm pretty curious to see which your favorite parts or mechanics of specific fights were. But on that note, I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank my Patreons for supporting me, and I'll see you in the next one.